This week on the Discovering God podcast, our God is a God of miracles, right?
Two things that I would say just on the end of that. One, just because you don't see the miraculous or signs or wonders in your life right now doesn't mean God's not with you. Gideon in the Old Testament shows that. And just because you see somebody in your life that's claiming to have signs and wonders and all these favors of God doesn't mean they're actually carrying the hand of God behind them, because Jesus also has a teaching about, I'm going to send people away that claim to do things in my name that was never me to begin with.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another Discovering God podcast. I'm Rip Wahlberg.
I'm Jeff McLean.
Yeah, we're glad you're joining us. So, Jeff, today we're going to talk about signs and wonders and miracles.
Signs, miracles, wonders. All right.
And what's been running around in my head is how does the church use this terminology? Sort of how are we interpreting, how does the interpretation of our theology about it influence how it gets used and expressed in the church? And among other things, one of the things that I feel I witnessed and watched over time was that it sort of has become a focus on the self and always on the power essence. And we also think about it through a scientific lens. Did their limb grow or not? And there's kind of that kind of thing. People discuss that really. Did the leg grow? Well, that you can replicate that and blah, blah, blah. But how have you experienced this miracles, or, is it kind of a condensed thing for you in your experience as people using it? Is it a broad expression?
Yeah, I think that almost always in my experience, and growing up not believing in signs and wonders and healings, things like that, coming to faith later on in a movement that practice those things, I see this conversation really always around, are there otherworldly, unexplainable things happening? But I think the word miracle implies a lot more than just that.
Yeah, because where it started for me was I started thinking about, you hear the terms, but it's like they're echoes. They're not spoken from the stage much. When they are, they're spoken sort of ubiquitously. Similar to the idea of the Bible has three primary words for sin: iniquity, and transgression. But in our world today, we basically distill everything down into sin.
And maybe not even sin anymore. Now we distill it to brokenness or other things. I continually see.
Maybe that's another podcast, right? So we kind of talk, because we focus so much in a scientific mindset, we talk about miracles. And it's always the power element of the miracle. So I want to talk today, about, I want to try to let the Bible speak for itself and just do a deep dive into how does the Bible from the Old to the New express these terms.
I like that.
Yeah. So, and what I want to try to get at is, why does the Bible use the terms? Why is it using three terms as opposed to just one? Can we find that out, and what the language is? Is there a difference how they use them, or is it used synonymously? Are they all but synonyms? So is it like a what do they call that? A difference without without the substance about it. Or is it legit? So,
and the church has many opinions on what we're about to talk about.
Yeah, distinctive without a difference.
Yeah, distinctive without a difference, right? So the church approaches the topic of miracles in many different ways.
The Old Testament has a number of different words that it uses that the Bible would express between signs, wonders, and miracles. The first one is that we can look at is miracles, and there's multiple words for this if we have the pronunciation right, but it's moped, and it means sign, wonder, or miracle. So right out of the gate, I'm kind of like, shoot, are they all one and the same?
And it almost carries with it a reverence of God's sign. Like it's meant to convey conviction about God in some way, is my understanding of the word mo faith. Like it carries with it an intent of convicting or bringing discernment upon somebody.
Okay.
Through the sign of God's power. Yeah.
Okay. And the other was is a noun, and it's, I want to say Pele, but that's the soccer player, but it's something close to that, right? So it's used as a noun.
Pele, maybe, yeah.
Yeah. And so then basically,
and that is more of a wonder.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just
So then I think to let the Bible speak for itself is, how do particular biblical authors use these words? Yeah. So Psalm 77:14, it says, "You are the God who performs miracles." Yeah. But what it means is, the word there is, I believe it's Pele, and it means astounding things.
Right, yeah.
So that word is a noun, and
you're producing wonders. You're producing awe or shock,
to the human being. Yeah, exactly.
I would say, like the birth of a child, that awe that you feel like, wow, that's miraculous. That's Pele there. It's the idea of just, there's a wonder to this thing,
right? And so it doesn't necessarily, it's not trying to say science as we think of science.
That's right.
Right. Then you have the word oat. So going further back, Exodus 4:8, 9, and 17, it all has this word for sign, and it means miracle as we think of them. I feel. So Exodus 4:7, Moses, he puts his hand in and out of the cloak, and when he puts it in, it was clean. When it comes out, it's leprous, right? So that's certainly a miracle,
right?
In that, but I think it's also not sign language, but it's a term for a sign.
Right.
What were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say that word also carries with it not only just a sign, but it's witnessing to something. My research, when I was looking at this word, really ties it a lot to prophetic signs. It's showing that God is up to something, a sign, a miracle, a pledge that divine presence is with them. So another example where it's used is in Nehemiah 9:10, and he says, "You sent signs and wonders against Pharaoh, against his officials." Right? That word, "you sent signs," you sent these prophetic warnings or things that were going to come true. That is the same use of that word there as well.
Yeah. And then the same thing happening later in the passage, back as well in Exodus, the sign of blood poured, or the water poured out, and it becomes from the Nile onto the dirt, becomes blood. So that would be something that we would think of in terms like a miracle, because we're thinking about it today in terms of the science that doesn't normally happen, right? Blind eyes don't see again. Limbs don't regrow, let's say. Deaf ears don't open. So all those things that have our scientific backing, that's sort of how, that would be going. But what they'd be thinking of besides science like us, they'd still be doing what you were looking at or saying, that's a sign from a God.
Yeah.
There's a message in this that I'm supposed to be taking away from it, not, wow, that was a neat show kind of attitude.
And I think there's a belief of this in our culture. We may not always connect it to God, but I hear people say things to me all the time, right? Like, the universe gave me a sign.
Yeah.
That kind of pointing aspect is what we're talking about, though, with a divine being driving them.
And think about what that means by itself. Like, part of why we look for miracles is because humanly we're built to connect with divinity.
Yeah. Creation longs to connect with its creator.
Yeah. 1 Kings 13:3, signs meant to bring people to belief in Christ. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of my notes, but again, they're not scientific in their nature.
Right.
The word sign there is just saying it's a message. So I like what the homiletics book or hermeneutics book that we're doing right now. they have a quote in there that says, signs are meant to bring people to believe in Christ.
Yeah, it speaks to that convictional aspect. I like that.
Yeah.
You know, signs already we're establishing are much bigger than just this define of nature. I Googled earlier, what is the most common accepted definition of miracle? Just generic, not breaking it down and how we're breaking it down. And the most common idea, and you're speaking to this, is that it defies the natural world in some way, or that it goes against what we know to be scientifically and logically correct. Which, by the way, if you've ever read the book Miracles by C.S. Lewis, he challenges that a little bit and says that he believes, his exact quote was, he says, miracles do not, in fact, break the laws of nature. Goes on to make the argument that because God has created the world, they are very much normal and part of our existence, our sustaining. But, almost always when we categorize miracles, we're incorporating signs, wonders, healings into this generic, that it's just this sense of breaking the barriers of nature or the way the universe works. And you're already pointing out that there's many layers to that, and some of them look a little more general than necessarily define nature or define
the laws of science,
yeah,
right? Laws of physics and so forth, like an axe floating, right? Like
right.
In the Old Testament. I mean,
The NIV, by the way, only uses the word miracle 28 times,
right?
Which automatically implies to me, and there's way more miracles than that, or miraculous things, if we're going to generalize,
right,
that happen in the Old and New Testament.
Right.
But the word miracle only appears about 28 times, which tells me, they happen a lot less commonly than many church leaders would have us think they do. But I do believe they're still happening. I'm just
right. I'm not taking you as trying to make an argument case against miracles happen today or not, right? What I find is that the Bible seems to be using it so much more broadly than we're teaching about it inside of our churches, conferences, seminars,
that's right,
equippings, whatever. Even if we, and let's say, yes, we want to not just see miracles, but we want to recognize that one of the other passages tells me our God is a God of miracles, right? But not even the manner in which or the frequency with which we're pursuing them, but maybe the manner in which we're pursuing them compared to how the Bible uses the language. And so I wanted to try to take something of a more substantive dive. What's interesting, I don't have the quote for this, but I remember reading some time ago, as you just noted, people, they can't actually define the word with one agreed upon definition. So some believe that and would define miracle as the thing that breaks the laws of our science in this natural world, right? And then you go C.S. Lewis, who took the different approach and defined it differently. That's all over the place.
Yeah.
And yet within the church, we're basically boiling it down to how do you break into the spiritual realm
to get a blessing,
pull heaven to earth to get a blessing that looks related to science, the things. And then what it does is it wows us. And I am reminded, I can't remember the passage, but I'm reminded where Jesus kind of reprimanded them for that mindset. This is not a circus. Like you came for a show, and just because of that, I'm not giving you one.
And we have the story in the New Testament of somebody that wanted the miraculous power that he saw in the apostles to utilize for his own means and goods.
Yeah.
And, I think today we've shrunken miracles to this thing that we consume through a spiritual life that is meant to make us feel secure in our faith or bless us in some prosperous way. But if we'd actually had the time to look at every time that a miraculous thing happens, my gut reaction, and just on a little bit of research I was doing this week, there's going to be more calling out or more conviction or more challenging, much more than bless me, prosper me.
Yeah. So the final word in the Old Testament that we're going to look at is the word for wonders. First Chronicles 16 and First Chronicles 17. So it says, remember the wondrous works that he has done. So the word for wonder is really that word for wonderful and marvelous, basically. Remember the wondrous works, the things that made you, again, it gives you a sense of awe. That's what that word wonder. And they're using it kind of in a synonymous way with the other two, but they do use them to express something significant.
Yeah, agreed.
Second Chronicles or First Chronicles 17:21, and who is like your people Israel, the one nation on earth, whom God went to redeem to be his people, making for yourself a name for great and awesome things in driving out nations. So it's that sense of the thing that brought fear and awe and reverence because of a mighty act that God had done. Yeah. So he brings a whole nation out of pulls them out of the grips of the most powerful nation on the earth at that time. And that right there, not just the miracle of the Nile and the frogs and the locusts and everything, but the wonder that our God can do that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. It's also interesting, just as you were talking about this, miracles were not always, even in the Old Testament or First Testament, a sign that God was with his people. So I think of Pharaoh, and his magicians are able to reproduce the same miraculous work that Moses does, right? On top of that, Gideon in Judges 6:13 says, but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? So he's questioning that he feels like the hand of God is off him. And he says, where are all the wonders that our ancestors told us about? And that word for wonders is pala, that Pele word. It's a wondrous or marvelous work. Where's the extraordinary, the things outside of the ordinary? It doesn't mean that God's not with him, but he's not necessarily breaking through in these ways right now. And just comparing what we're reading to what we're saying the church is doing today, it's almost like these things need to accompany everything we are doing at all times to prove we are who we are and what God's doing. But God's people have gone through some times where miracles weren't evident on their journeys as well.
Right. And it doesn't, like you said, it doesn't mean God's not with you.
Right.
It doesn't even mean God's not for you.
That's right.
God's going to do those things first for the sake of his own name and his own glory. Yeah. Secondly, he will do those things because he does love and care for humans.
Right. To call us or correct us in some way.
Yep. Or to deliverance is seen as a miracle and a sign and a wonder, right? Yeah. So deliverance from demonic oppression, well, God will do that because he does care about his kids. Yeah. And he does want them set free, right? Right. The fact that you mentioned Egypt, like God's going to first, the signs and stuff there, the fact that they could replicate it, we were always told, well, that was with dark magic. And I think like that has truth. I think that has legs, right? In the end, what's interesting is they might have been able to reproduce the miracles, but to me, I'm not sure I ever read that they could reproduce the signs. Or the wonders.
Yeah, that would be a good conversation. Yeah.
Right? Like they didn't produce the wonders of God. Ra
it was replicated.
Didn't take his people out of the clutches of an oppressive nation.
Right.
But Yahweh did.
Right. Yeah.
So almost like not to say, well, should we be looking for more signs or wonders like that? But do we allow for them to have weight and value in our Christian life? The way that we seek miracles, like, and celebrate them.
Yeah. Even in the Old Testament, I'm starting to think that all miracles, how I might define them, different than they're breaking the laws of nature, is there's a liberating act. People are liberated from themselves, from an oppressor, from the broken world around them, or they're liberated from the wrong thinking in the path that they're on. All of them have a freedom aspect to them. And I would also say they're all restorative in some way. They're meant to be restorative in some way.
I think in that case, God is doing those things because because of the cosmic geography of it all, right? The nature of the story, God is actively always working to bring about the final redemption
right.
of his temple, right? This earth, his creation. And it's not that he's too weak and keeps wrestling for it, but that these are inbreaking activities of God.
That's good. Saying that, it made me think. I mean, so miracles also, something that's important for us to take away, often have a dualistic application. What I mean by that is sometimes we look at all of the miracles in the Old Testament and say all this miraculous behavior is just pointing to Jesus and what Jesus is going to do. But it also meant some really real things for the people that were in those moments too. And so there's a dualistic nature to miracles where it is a sign and a wonder, a healing, a restoration moment for them, but it's also pointing to the greater hand of God, the greater favor of God at work. And I think that's still true in the New Testament. Would uphold that Jesus is demonstrating miracles that also point to a greater fulfillment that's yet to come.
Yeah, yeah. So, ready to go into the New Testament?
Let's do it.
All right. In the New Testament, this is again what kind of I would be more familiar with. I think ultimately you would be more familiar with. So you have the Greek word, it's dunamis. It's kind of the place
power,
where the power where you get the word dynamite from. Matthew 11, 20 to 23. These all have the word for miracles in it. And then there's the word deeds, though.
Which describes most of the things that Jesus does, by the way, is a dumas. It's this huge, he's just flexing the kingdom's power.
Yeah, it's right. It's sort of like a word, you could say it's raw power, right? You have the duality of power and authority, and Jesus is using both. But in the New Testament, driving out a demon would be seen as dunamis.
Yeah.
Right. A blind eye and a deaf ear would be seen as dunamis.
And this is the authority Jesus sends his 12 and 72 out and us to the ends of the earth with.
To do miracles.
Yeah.
Right. And they were sort of defined as heal the sick.
Yeah.
Raise the dead.
Right.
That's an act of power. Paul even wanted to know Christ and the dunamis power of his resurrection. Right.
He mentions that often too. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a very common word. I agree with it. I don't want to sit here and make the case like we shouldn't pursue it or it's stopped or all that. Like we're not doing that discussion in this podcast, but I was made aware that this is still a very hotly discussed topic, and I was like surprised. I'm like, that hasn't ended yet.
Yeah.
Haven't we been going around in this for no less than the last 30 to 40 years by now?
And just to give an idea what Rip's talking about, and like one modern take on this is that these are acts of justice that God's doing. He's using his divine power to enact some sort of king's justice on people. So I've seen a lot recently, some more progressive scholars taking Jesus's what we would say are otherworldly or divine miracles, signs, and saying they're no more than acts of restorative justice. And I think that's a stretch on the word in my own research, but I have seen that argument made. To me, the most historic understanding of this word truly is, regardless if we believe a miracle is happening today or not, it's just that it is the power, the hand of God doing mighty works.
And the way that whether it's restorative justice or is it, which I'm sure you've heard a lot too, it's just the representation of two kingdoms colliding.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So another word, this is one I think it might be used more, is the word ergon. It looked like it was used 169 times in the New Testament. Only 6 out of those times it means miracle.
Right, it's carrying the miraculous stuff.
Which is very interesting. So it's basically the word for deeds.
Yeah.
Right? Similar to, just your mighty deeds, your wondrous deeds back in the Old Testament.
I love that, though, because you and I, coming out of the vineyard, we have a saying, naturally supernatural, which means that the very ordinary things we can do might be pregnant with extraordinary power or meaning And so sometimes Jesus is doing deeds that are truly just ordinary tasks. And
Yeah.
sometimes the hand of God just shows up in those things. And I love the dualistic of that word as well.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of references. Let's I'm going to grab one here. See what John 7:3 says.
Yeah.
Just to try to let the Bible speak, but I should have bookmarked this, shouldn't I? John 7:3. And it says, so his brother said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that the disciples may see the works you are doing."
Yeah.
That word would be deeds, right? So it's not saying so that your disciples can see the miracles. But it's conveying the same idea. So Jesus is doing these things, and my takeaway is, this is where I mentioned it before, but my takeaway when I was looking at this, going, is there a break? Do we make a distinction? Is it a distinction without a difference? My takeaway from this is, when I look at these passages, the works that Jesus is doing. Oh, our God is a God of miracles.
Yeah.
Right? So I want to highlight that based on his nature, not based on what's in the goodie bag for me by itself.
That's right.
And unto itself.
That passage, again, plays into, it's inclusive of all things that Jesus was doing, his signs and wonders and his teaching ministry. And so, we tend to hone all of our, in the charismatic world or some worlds, just all into, we need the power.
Yeah.
But there's ordinary stuff that Jesus did too that still had otherworldly consequences.
So here's one that I thought was really interesting.
All right.
John 2, verse 11. Jesus is at the wedding of Cana.
Yep.
And he turns out of necessity to save the cultural embarrassment of the hosts and the bride and the groom and the host parents. To save the embarrassment, he turns water into wine.
Great party trick.
What would we call that today?
So again, because miracles has become an overarching thing, often this is called Jesus's first miracle.
And yet the Bible doesn't call it a miracle.
Right.
It doesn't call it dunamis. It calls it a sign.
I remember looking at this in seminary. Yeah.
So what did they say? What about in seminary? What did they say, or what did you come away with? Or
now you're testing what I can remember.
Oh, sorry. That's off the cuff.
Yeah. What I remember is that, it would carry that prophetic sign. So it would carry a relation to, what was the word in the old, oath, which is the banner or the witness to something. Oath, by the way, the oath word is where we get oath from. So Jesus is making an oath, or God is making an oath. Again, it's usually tied in with a prophetic nature.
Making a commitment of
some
sort.
So we see that in Exodus and Nehemiah. And not all those, but that word in the Old Testament, not every time it's used is a miracle either. Sometimes it's just God opening a door. And so I think it's just important to note here too that not everything Jesus does in the New Testament might be miraculous, or less we're generalizing miracles. So what was your reflections on this word not being miracle?
Well, I just thought it was interesting because that would be an automatic scientific thought for us. And that's probably why we automatically call it a miracle. So is it a distinction without a difference, or does it matter? Because the Bible does not call it a miracle. It doesn't have that word. It has the word for sign. And so I think the biblical John is probably trying to say something different. So then you have to look in context and start to jump back and start with, why did John write the book? What's the message he's trying to convey first, right? And it's, among other things, this is the God who created all of it. We've seen him. He walked among us. We walked with him.
He proved to be.
In the beginning was the Word. This is the beginning of John, right? So John is trying to prove that God became a man and we were with him.
and he's making new wine, which is very symbolic in their time for new seasons, new ways of living with God.
Okay. Um, and basically, I think uh, that is not focusing first on the miracle. I think it's trying to put the focus on the one who performed the deed.
Yeah, agreed.
And so, what's the message? What is it a sign of? I think it's trying to convey the sign Jesus is Lord.
So here again, where miracles carry multiple things for me, because that is the point of it. Jesus is who he says he is, but it also meant something for the host not to be really embarrassed in front of the town. There's this, right, here's the restorative. And there's also a realization that God's blessing people. He's bringing a sense of abundance into their life. I mean, it's better than anything else they had.
Right.
And so the miracles have this now meaning, but they also have the theological, where John's taking it, right? Jesus is who he says he is.
Well, and I think what we may want to focus on off enough besides the miracle is the miracle that's done for you. Like Jesus loved them, therefore Jesus loves you.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to put the emphasis on the human side of it,
right.
Because I would prefer to kind of speak against that as our first step. I want to say break it, but I'm never going to have that impact. But to speak against that as being our first thought, what's in this for me? I think John is taking that message, and the first thought is, what does this say about Jesus? Is it that he cares enough about you, or is it that he cares?
Yeah.
And that's, again, might be a small distinction, but to try to think about what is this telling us about the heart of God is that he's not ambivalent. He actually cares. He saw the issue of human reality, and he did something about it. Compelled by love and compassion, right? So to me, I'd rather focus there and spend some time in some meditative time just pondering that. And even saying, well, the fact that Jesus cares, John's trying to tell us God cares, bracket, about you. Yes, but the fact that he cares, how does that confirm what I've thought about him? Or how does that speak contrary to what I have thought about him?
Well, I think all miracles, especially in the New Testament, point to a character of God or a characteristic trait of God. I often say that the gospel, a word that we use in the New Testament, is proclaiming both God's good news, but also his goodness. I like alliteration. So good news, goodness.
Yes.
And in this passage, the good news is Jesus is who he says he is, but the goodness is that God is caring about people in the condition that they are in.
Yeah, absolutely.
By the way, I was in a church one time.
Okay.
That was unpacking this passage. I was just attending it for that Sunday. And the pastor probably spent 30 minutes of a 40-minute sermon undermining that Jesus really didn't make wine. That in his opinion, because it was not a miracle, this is where he went with it, and it was a sign that it really was just this flavored water that tasted better, but they were too drunk to know it. And so Jesus didn't actually produce wine, and what they were experiencing was a pure life with God, and they weren't used to it. And so those kind of arguments, yes, you had it with a lot of sugar.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you remember when we were kids and we made it. It was like,
yes.
You have to read so much into that passage to remove the power of God from it. No, I believe this is truly miraculous in the fact that something defied what we know to be true.
Yeah.
But it carries not so much that he's doing a miracle as much as he's pointing to the goodness of the Father and who he is.
Yeah, it's that hard thing of how do you do interpretation of God's word well? And sometimes the plain meaning is the meaning.
Keep it simple.
Jesus turned water into wine, not by dumping powdered sugar in.
Right.
He just changed it by the will of God because of the compassion of God. Yeah. So real quick, signs
Yeah.
I think I would say they confirm God's message to be true. So signs confirm a prophetic message, for example, right? Wonders.
The word for
Yeah,
signs
sorry,
in
go
the New
ahead.
Testament is Simeon, and that's also equivalent to the word oth in the Old Testament, or just this unusual occurrence that transcends the common sense of nature.
Okay. Wonders are more about the works of God that produce awe, wonder, and fear.
Yeah.
Like it produces a reverence, the mighty work that he did, and it produced that reverence or the fear. He drives the Canaanites out. They were already filled with the fear of God because they'd heard of the deeds of God before the Israelites ever got to Canaan.
Ironically, this word gets compared to Mopheth or Mopeth in the Old Testament. That idea that it's just the power of God on display that puts fear into them. The signs in the sky that they know it's right. They're going, I saw a sign, right? That thing more than miracle. Like they're not singing, I believe in miracles. They're saying, I saw a sign, a direction. And so that's connected to the Old Testament word.
And often those things were in part of nature. Right, they saw signs, and they saw nature indicating signs from the gods. And then there's miracles, God's mighty works. They're often mostly of power, some out of authority. Both deliverance of a demonic affliction is both power and authority at work.
Do you think sometimes the New Testament writers just use the word miracles too, so they don't have to break down everything they're doing? They may not even themselves always have yet understood, was Jesus doing a sign here? Was he doing a wonder here? Was he, and so sometimes I think the word miracle too just becomes a catch-all because it's hard in the moment to necessarily always read the signs of what God is doing. I'm just thinking out loud. I
know you're thrown against the wall. I personally, only speaking for myself, my thought is I've always heard that the biblical authors like use their thoughts and the writing intentionally, right? And I feel like we're the ones that kind of put everything into one basket, and the Bible seems to have used those words more broadly with some kind of intention. And
it's possible.
Yeah, it could be. So I think I'm not trying to at all disagree with your thought. Just like my thought on that would be this kind of thing.
So you left one thing out of this conversation so far.
What was that?
Healing.
Oh, yeah, okay.
So also usually miracles for people when they're reading New Testament speak to healings being included
as miracles,
right?
The person with the fever and the dead person,
Peter's mother-in-law,
dead people being raised,
whatever,
Peter's mother-in-law with the fever,
the
Jairus's daughter,
right,
Lazarus, right, raising the dead, all that healing,
but lepers even, and so
yeah,
you and I may disagree on this. I actually, and this could lead to comments, that's fine, I separate healing out of all those things if I follow the idea that Scripture should interpret Scripture the best. There's a story where Jesus goes into his hometown, and he's in his hometown, and people are so put off that Joseph's son is acting in the way that he's acting. And it says he couldn't do any miracles there except a few healings. And so that differentiating, if we're going with the argument that New Testament writers choose their words with great intentionality. The separation of healing, and that healings were able to be done where signs and wonders or miracles could not, to me, is an important thing. And in fact, healing, there's a couple of words in the New Testament for it, but the most common is Rapha, right? That's the most common used. It's a deliverance from disease, demonic condition, okay? Some sort of condition. And so for me, healing might have sign aspects to it at times. It may have wonder and awe to it. But I think healing is much different than the other things we're talking about.
Well, then
some scholars are going to hate that and disagree, but that's where I'm at.
But that would only support what I kind of started out, right?
I agree with you.
Which, meaning we're throwing everything into one big bucket.
Right.
And the Bible seems to be using terms more broadly, and I think there's a reason. Like I think He uses them more intentionally. Where a lot of the circuit guys will use healing and miracle, and they're basically using them as synonyms.
Yep, agreed.
Right? You can go back and forth between either one. And my whole premise here is I think that's mistake. I think that's, I don't want to say wrong, but at a minimum, it's like misuse without intention, without malice.
Now, I haven't tallied it, but based on my reading, and just like when it says, then he healed other people and other diseases, we can assume that Jesus spent much more time healing than he did creating signs, wonders, miracles, and these kind of all moments. And so, to me, healing, again, to use a C.S. Lewis, is much more normal.
Almost a different category.
It's a different, and to me, that's the stuff I want to pursue. And healing, by the way,
a good point. Healing
is never yourself. Spiritual formation, as M. Robert Holland says, is being formed in the image of Jesus for the sake of others. Healing, I would argue, is being experiencing Jesus so you can heal others, right? It's always other focused. The miracles that we seek often in church or when we're arguing about them is show me God, or bless me God, guide me God. Healing is something I think we should pursue even more of. I have seen more healings in my life than what I would say miracles, right? I'm not walking into restaurants, ordering a glass of water, wiping my hand over it and turning it into wine to save money. You know what I mean?
But you might pray for the server's back pain.
I would, and we've been in rooms together where that stuff has happened.
And that happens. Yes. So, all right. So that's a great point. Thank you for bringing it up. I can't remember if I had thought about that or not, but it's a very important point, and I really like it. We should do one, maybe one, just on healing.
Yeah.
So, real quick, final thoughts.
Yeah.
How can this apply to the person that is basically knows they're seeking God, or doesn't even know they're seeking God?
Yeah. When you approach the scriptures and you're looking at miracles, you can be open to it, which is the category some people fall into. You may be close to it, which is some people are close to it, or you may be saying, I think those kind of things can still happen, or what we call a continuist. Or you may be an ethicist. You're someone that just says these are just acts of justice, of ethics. They're not actually otherworldly, miraculous things. My encouragement would be, yeah, those are the main four camps. But when you approach the scriptures, let the scriptures speak to you. I think that if you allow them to be if you allow their categories to speak to you, what God is doing in a moment, the signs, pay attention to these things as you're reading. Don't just assume they're all miracles. See what God is doing, or the way that God is conforming that he is God or is God. Look for the acts of conviction or call that is in there. And then I think also you pay attention to the things that you think are God showing up in your life, and discern, is this a sign? Is this a miracle? Is this, so on. What about you? What are your summarized takeaways?
So one, I would say, similar to what you're saying, and let's say the person is like, I'm desperate, I don't believe in God, but I'm going to throw up a prayer. I would say, okay, watch for the sign of when and how that prayer was answered.
Yeah.
Right? Watch for the normal evidence of life that prayer, the thing that you were concerned about enough to throw a prayer up in desperation, how did that thing in life get addressed?
Yeah.
And the time between the two. Now, it doesn't matter if it was long or short, but did it actually? Because I think a lot of times you hear those stories and it's kind of like poof, like it oh my gosh. And are we actually connecting? Because I think there is an important connection to be made between that. That's a sign of God working. I think the one perhaps closer to my heart is about maybe somebody who would be holding God at arm's length because any bad stuff, whatever they've experienced in life, and believing that God doesn't care. Didn't care enough to act, doesn't care about them, therefore, and however else those lies and strongholds are going on for them, is to say, sorry for that. And the revelation of God in the Bible is that he actually does care.
Yeah.
And it's not that he's incapable. It's that he does care. And are we willing to risk letting him in to those places, because that is where miracles and signs would begin to happen.
Yeah,
So that's why I think it's important and how I think it relates today. Sorry.
No, it's
You
fine.
can have
I
the
think
final word.
two things that I would say just on the end of that. One, just because you don't see the miraculous or signs or wonders in your life right now doesn't mean God's not with you. Gideon in the Old Testament shows that. And just because you see somebody in your life that's claiming to have signs and wonders and all these favors of God doesn't mean they're actually carrying the hand of God behind them, because Jesus also has a teaching about, I'm going to send people away that claim to do things in my name that was never me to begin with.
Yeah.
And so I think, just be careful, test the spirits.
Yep. All right. Thanks for being with us. And we hope that you will go read some of these passages, think about it, go search it for yourself, come face to face with God by coming face to face with his word. We hope you enjoyed another episode of the Discovering God podcast. And if you did, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. And you can find us on all the social media platforms under Discovering God. Just look for the compass.